I was asked to give a talk on Japan in terms of populism. Then, as Professor Klein nicely introduced, I've been now starting a new project on collecting some data on the Japanese populism. And to get started, I thought it would be nice to think about this populism, the trends that have been going on since 1990s, but still not necessarily reflected in the current debates. Some people may regard Japan as an uncharted territory of global populism. We're not actually seeing very viable sort of populist leaders, according to them. So the role for me today, I guess, is to disentangle these kind of like a myth and what we can do about it with the new research. So to get started, let me show you a sort of the map of global populism in the last 5 years. This was published in 2018, so it's still, it's a bit now outdated, but still it gives us a good image about understanding about how populism is spread out across the regions. As you can see, most obvious sort of usual suspects, I don't know, sorry to mention some European countries, but it's spread out quite globally. But when it comes to Asian countries, including Japan, it doesn't say that the populism is increasing. This is based on the expert survey conducted by one of the institutes in Munich on the economic research, asking the experts on the question about how's the role of populism changed in your country in the last 5 years. Japan is marked as pretty much status quo. Let me also give you a couple sort of articles that we can find in the international media, one of which asks why is Japan post-populist free? And there they ask populism is basically sweeping Europe, the United States, and India, large parts of Southeast Asia, but Japan has so far appeared to be immune. And there's no such populist leaders like Geert Wilders, Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, and others. And they ask why. Another article asks, Japan has avoided the turbulence, and Japan somehow has this firewall against populism, and asking why this is the case. The last one is asking, in the last upper house election in 2019, there was supposed the right-wing and also left-wing populist parties. That remains to be debated if they qualified as populism. I'm sure that Professor Klein is an expert on this as well. But this article, assuming that there's been no such populist movement in Japan, now is populism finally coming to Japan? So that's really the assumption that we can see from this setup, that there had been no such populist movement and parties. So the aim of this talk is to give a bit of this reflection on the notion that Japan is actually immune to populism. Obviously, I'd like to show that Japan, contrarily, has actually experienced certain level of populism, and also to suggest that such experiences have prevented the surge of full-fledged populism, if you like, as seen elsewhere in the world. So that's given the fact that we have seen certain populism, especially since 1990s, that have paved the way for the lack of obvious populist parties or populist leaders. Let me start and also go back to what we understand by populism in Japan, because there's been quite a few groundbreaking and important work on populism. The one is given by Professor Hideo Take of Kyoto University, what he called the Japanese style populism. Then he gives three elements to this Japanese style populism. One is present themselves as outsider of ordinary people against elite. Secondly, reduce politics to a fight between the morally good and bad and between friends and enemies. And on this second point, Professor Toru Yoshida, I'm sure he is also one of the presenters in this seminar series. He describes these characteristics of populist politics as politics of making enemies, tekizukuri no seiji, in his earlier book in 2011. So he echoes this characteristic of friends and enemies. And these two, if you can recall the famous sort of definition of populism by Kasmure of anti-establishment, anti-elite, that's the first one. And also Manichaeism of something that people call it for this black and white friends and enemies kind of morally good and bad. So these two pretty much correspond to these two definitions. And on top of these, people of course mention about, the people-centrism, homogeneity, and other dimensions of populism. But one thing that is quite characteristic and something quite, let's say, Japanese about in this definition of populism is that it exploits the mass media through theatrical style. So this notion of theatricality, let's say, is unique to this Japanese discourse on populism. And it's core factor both in Otake's, Professor Otake's work, and also as well as Professor Yoshida. They both mention about it. And also the work on populism of Toru Hashimoto, which is one of the local leaders in Osaka, by Professor Arima. He also mentions this theater style populism, gekijō-teki populism in his works. This can be also traced to the notion of kanzen chōaku, also mentioned by Otake sensei and Professor Yoshida, which can be translated as poetic justice or morality play to describe the populist rhetoric, basically evoking the dramatic tradition of the morality play in which good and evil both are personified. So these are the sort of three components for when scholars were talking about Japanese style populism. And then they based their arguments on the examples most exemplified by the Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi in 2001-2006 as an example for neoliberal populist politician. But this formulation of this populism has been applied to many local leaders, including Toru Hashimoto that I just mentioned, but also Yuriko Koike, the current governor in Tokyo, and also Takashi Kawamura, who is the current Nagoya mayor. I'm not going to talk in details of these cases. I'm sure that you have a chance of hearing much more detailed account on these local leaders by other scholars. So I'm gonna move on to base my talk on the two perspectives that I'd like to bring in. So far we've talked about basically analytical concept of populism, but what is striking in the Japanese case is that populism has been used as a term, not as a term to analyze these political situations, but also the as a common currency in the political scene. So as a real discourse, populism has been a part of the real discourse since 1990s. So I want to show how this, populism as a term, people call it a populism just, without really just as such, as an idea and also the frame that really actually shaped the politics in Japan since the mid 1990s. So I want to show you how populism is understood by the media and also the general public, and to highlight this gap between this discourse basically shared in the media and then also by the people, and the analytical concept that we have for populism. And then also move on to look at populism as an analytical concept, then to discuss how we can understand populism as a phenomena in line with the reform politics that has been going on since 1990s. So firstly, let me show you this graph of the usage of populism as a terminologies in the mass media. Basically, this shows the number of newspaper articles in 5 newspapers of Yomiuri, Asahi, Mainichi, Nikkei, and Sankei, 5 newspapers since 1984 until last year. And then the journal periodical articles, like academic journals, but also commercial magazines, and all the periodical articles on this right-hand axis. As you can see, the first sort of increase of this, so it includes the terms of populism and also populist. So it counts the number of articles that use at least once of the term populism or populist, has started to increase in the 1990s. That coincides with the period of reform politics, let's say, something that I'm going to talk about later on. And then the second spike is during the Koizumi era, when he came in power in 2001 until 2006. That's pretty much coincides with this timing. Then the next one is during the DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan's governments between 2009 to 2012. And then afterward, it's really 2016 of the Brexit and also the US presidency of Donald Trump. So let's say global populism. So these are the 4 sort of moments in which Japan has experienced the usage of populism or populist. And this, in terms of this first populism as a common currency, it has been often referred to as ideas or policies which pander to the electorate. So populism is understood as a basically satisfying the people with short-term benefits. So it's a strategy by politicians to make constituents, voters happy with the actual benefits. So newspapers started to translate populism as in Japanese, Taishu Geigo Shugi, which is pandering to the masses or pandering to the people. And if we go back to the newspapers like Yomiuri Shimbun, presented this term with the translation. Every time when the populism in katakana, in the sort of Japanese phonetic alphabet, shows populism, then within bracket, Taishu Geigo Shugi, which means pandering to the people, which is quite different from the understanding that we have as an analytical concept of populism. It's different from anti-elitism, different from people-centrism, but basically giving some short-term benefits to the people. And 56% of the articles in Yomiuri Shimbun have this two combination. And that's also pretty much the same with other papers to a lesser extent with Mainichi Shimbun 44%, 17% with Asahi Shimbun. Asahi Shimbun started with this translation of Taishu Geigo in 1990s, but they've stopped doing this in the Koizumi era. So there was a bit of a variation across newspapers, but that's how the media understood populism, which is, of course, has been also, that understanding has been also shared by the people from that medium. So it's pretty much of a political style, right? To make, that would make politicians popular. So I name it as popularism, rather than populism, just to make a distinction. So populism in the Japanese language since 1990s has some negative and pejorative connotations because of, it's just a political style for politicians to make them popular among the people, right? So even the Junichiro Koizumi, who is considered to be a prototype of populist politicians, according to Professor Otake and other scholars, he himself rejected this label as, being called as a populist. And there's a nice interview in Spiegel, in the German magazine, that says, where he says that he doesn't want to be called a populist because he understands, he believes that the policies that he's putting forward, what is the neoliberal policies, are actually asking people to sometimes suffer and to bear with the reduced public service. Like he introduced many proposed policies that could be quite make him unpopular among people. So he didn't understand why he would be called populist. But that's pretty much based on this understanding that populism is really about popularism rather than populism. Now let me move on to understanding the Japanese populism in light of more of the analytical concept. So this is something that is shared by the people and the media. But if we try to look at Japanese populism from the standpoint of all these discussions of definition of populism, like anti-elitist, people-centrism, Manichaeism, and theatrical way of doing things, that's another element that the Professor Otake and Yoshida also emphasized. I'd like to dig a bit further, also in terms of this from the lens of analytical concept of populism. And when we go back to the initial usage of populism in the media, one of the first articles that used populism in the context of Japanese politics is about when the Yukio Aoshima, who was elected as Tokyo governor in 1995, TV celebrity and also a long-term upper house member, who defeated the sort of, long-term bureaucrat candidate endorsed by LDP. So he was called populist. That's pretty much the first sort of appearance in the Japanese media of someone who is described as populist. And this label of populist became further established in the Japanese politics in the discussions between the former Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa criticized one of the DPJ's members, leaders. DPJ was set up in 1996, and in the newspaper of Asahi Shimbun, that he criticized DPJ as populist, and this DPJ leader sort of criticized, attacked on at the time, the finance minister of Miyazawa in the budget committee, and to withdraw the comment that he made in the newspaper. So it has a pejorative connotation already at the time. And also around the same time, the Yasuhiro Nakasone, the former prime minister who passed away recently, also called this DPJ newly set up political party as an urban Tokyo bourgeois, Yamanote, that's pretty much the center of Tokyo. And so as you can see, populism was introduced as initially as a part of urban citizens movement. And looking back at this era in the 1990s, scholars also characterized Japan New Party, which came into power in 1993 with the leader Morihiro Hosokawa, as a new populist as a new populist party, but also a populist leader, which is also echoed by Hideo Take as a list of past populist leaders. So this allows us to understand how populism has been used in the early initial phase. And during that time in the 1990s, we can see what I call the zeitgeist of reform politics. So this, it's the spirit of the age that was shared pretty much in the 1990s, that the various things in the Japanese political system and also economic system have to be reformed. And this has also this has come with the increasing criticism and attacks on central government bureaucrats. And if we go back to some of the scandals related to Ministry of Health and Welfare and also Ministry of Finance in the same time of 1990s, there was a health scandal over HIV tainted blood. Basically, that the blood was not properly heated, and that problem was known way before that it came apparent by the Ministry of Health and Welfare. So that was a huge scandal at the time. I think 40% of the people who needed the blood, of the transfusion of the blood, died because of this. And the leader of the DPJ, which was newly set up in 1996, Naoto Kan, happened to be the health minister. So he confronted with the bureaucrats of that ministry and tried to disclose the information that the ministry bureaucrats had, and also formally apologized to the people who had to suffer from this HIV tainted blood. So Miyazawa also described Naoto Kan as the general populist. So, and that's also the same understanding by Hideo Otake, who also mentioned the Naoto Kan, who became the prime minister in 2010 in the DPJ government at the time as a populist leader. There are also financial scandals over mishandling of housing loan company Jusen, and also officials accepting some bribes from banks that they were supposed to be overseeing. So there were sort of, massive sort of anti-elite sentiment for these scandals and wrongdoing. And Keishi Saiki, who also argued that the criticism of elite bureaucrats led to populism among the people and the media. And as you can see, the central government bureaucrats are really the elite of the elite in Japan. most of them are the graduates of, the very highly ranked department of the highly ranked university. That's pretty much University of Tokyo. And this negative publicity inevitably contributed to the rise of broadly anti-elite public sentiment. So that's pretty much of the zeitgeist. So we can see some anti-elitist element already in 1990s. Then the next spike that we saw in the figure was the Koizumi's era, and who came into power in 2001. And his neoliberal policy, as you may recall, pretty much downsizing the central government and reforming public administration. So he privatized the post office and many public corporations, including the highway organizations. So that made him present and appear as a hero for battling entrenched interest, basically vested interest that have been kept in Japan. And so that made him sort of pretty much known as populist leader in Japan. So this neoliberal reforms are sort of like the continuation of the pretty much of the anti-elite sentiment that this 1990s reform politics era have paved the way. And then that goes on to the DPJ government. That was the third spike that we had in the figure, or let's say second spike after the Koizumi's era. And if we recall how DPJ came into power in 2009 is with the platform that basically echoed Koizumi's anti-bureaucrat reforms, basically putting political control back in place rather than the bureaucrats deciding, proposing all the bills. So prioritizing national interest instead of ministry's interest, and also forbidding what they call amakudari, basically retiring into high paid positions for industries, for the central government bureaucrats. Also, they stressed on the neoliberal reforms for doing very strict budget screening. So basically, they're calling the government bureaucrats to explain why the budget is so huge, and then they try to cut down the budget. So that's also the continuation of Koizumi's era, but also the DPJ has been criticized for putting forward this populism. That's the common usage that I explained. Basically giving a lot of short-term benefits like income compensation for farmers, child allowance, and partial elimination of expressway tolls. These are the policies that made DPJ notoriously known for populist, basically pandering to the people, right? So I'm just gonna finish this history of the last 20 years almost by the Abe era and beyond. Abe, so the DPJ government was almost like the end of this reform politics, even though Abe continued by the reform politics appeal, but he stopped criticizing central bureaucrats, but rather started to attack on liberal media journalists and also academic experts. So, so there was a bit of a shift of the target of what we can understand as elite. This coincides with the trend of global populism, basically undermining liberal ideas of checks and balances. Like Abe denied to call for the parliament in September 2015, although the 1/4 of parliamentarians in both houses of the upper house and lower house called for opening a parliament extraordinary session that is usually held in the fall, something that is now held at this moment. Even though the Article 53 of the Constitution requires the cabinet to open the parliamentary session. The examples are not exhaustive, but you can find that there was a lack of sort of appreciation of these, let's say, checks and balances. And he attacked on also Asahi Shimbun, for example, which is the progressive left-wing news media. And he even said it's been reported that he even said to Donald Trump that, he managed to tame Asahi Shimbun. So I hope you will be able to do the same for New York Times. Or the kind of this idea that he was attacking really on this liberal media and journalists, and also sometimes academic experts. And this kind of trend is now relayed to the current Suga government, that there's been now huge discussions going on with the Science Council. Some of the members who were recommended by the Science Council were not nominated by the government. So there's been a bit of anti-academic characteristics. And also, Suga government is currently now putting forward some reforms on mobile fees that are, in their words, too expensive. So it was a bit of this against the big industry, big tech of the main mobile sort of providers in Japan, 3 of them. And also there's a bit of a popularism element that he's trying to make sure that he can deliver short-term benefits, including this smaller fees for mobile, but also other benefits that they can receive in the short terms. So these are sort of feed into the current project that I'm doing, almost like a setup. Why these kind of non-political elites need to be put into a consideration when we talk about elite, which include bureaucrats, mainstream media, journalists, academics, experts, and big business and big tech industries. This very much coincides with this sort of like a blame shifting strategies taken by populist leaders who seized power. So populists usually start by criticizing political elite, right? So in that regard, there's not much of a need to differentiate several, several components or, difference within the elite. But once they are in power, they start to criticize. So they need a new target because they are already in power. So they start to shift the blames and then to target bureaucrats, mainstream media, mainly liberal media, academics, big business. This can be seen in the US. The Trump is pretty much criticizing liberal media. They have this trend. They discount the role of science, sometimes with some conspiracy theories. And also in Hungary that, Viktor Orban banned, for example, Central European University. They're pretty much against academics, human science and social science academics. So to me, it's a right moment to look at these non-political elite and also do some analysis of the discourse of politicians and parties, not just about political elite, but also how they attack these non-political elite. And also on the demand side, there's been many advancement in the studies, in the survey, try to understand the populist sentiment, populist attitude among people. There's been a batteries to measure the populist attitude, but we also need to consider this attitude toward non-political elites. So that's something that we want to do in this new project. So these, what I've now spoke about, pretty much come from the chapter we've written with Robert Fahy and Robert Pekkanen on populism in Japan in the new handbook of Japanese politics from Oxford that the Professor Klein is also, I'm sure, part of this production. So if you have any question, you might, I'd be happy to send a draft or to have a look at what is more detailed account of what I've just spoke about. So other references also included in the chapter that I now just mentioned.